Among all of Ireland's ancient treasures, it is perhaps its deep-rooted love of knowledge that is prized most amongst them. With the dawn of Christianity and the rise of the Irish monastery, the Irish became a less battle-prone people, although not totally so, and began to cling even more to their other love, learning and the written word. A manuscript of the Brehon law entitled the 𝗁𝗵𝗶𝘀 deals in part with the varying grades of social status based on one's profession or degree of learning, saying that wisdom is the mother of each profession, and it is from her hand they all drink. The pursuit of knowledge simply for the love of it was a common social and cultural trait that was reflected in the early Irish attitudes to open education. But the schools were very different from today. Before we go on, I'd like to give you an image of the early Irish schools by sharing this quote from Patrick Western Joyce. Quote, "There were no spacious lecture halls such as we have. The masters taught and lectured, and the scholars studied very much in the open air, when the weather permitted. There were no prizes and no cramming for competitive examinations, for learning was pursued for its own sake. In all the schools, whether public or private, a large proportion of the students got both books and education free, but those who could afford it paid for everything." It's hard to imagine an advanced education system covering topics that are familiar to us that is so remarkably different from our own. But try to imagine an education system where exams do not exist, and where students are not even in competition with each other, where the mark of a student was by his actual knowledge and understanding of his subject, not by how much of his lecture notes he could memorize a few weeks before the end of a semester and hope to be able to regurgitate on the day of a final test. And imagine an education system where knowledge was free to all who desired it. Although it wasn't competitive, it was carefully structured into varying grades. Like how students today progress through grades of education, these simply marked the degree of progression one had made in their personal studies. But it had more to do with the actual merit and substance of their studies rather than their age group, as is the case today. The early Irish education grades were described in a sequel to the 𝗁𝗵𝗀𝗀, where they are referred to as the 𝗁𝗵𝗀𝗀𝗀, or 7 grades of wisdom. This progression through the grades would take a minimum of 12 years to reach the highest grade, called an 𝗰𝗵, or professor. Speaking on the nature of the early Irish schools in his work, Ireland's Ancient Schools and Scholars, Reverend Healy states, quote, "We have abundant evidence that there were several schools of Gaelic character in which the vernacular language was cultivated with great success, and not merely the language, but also the history, the antiquities, the laws, and the literature of the nation." And he says that laymen generally had better opportunities of obtaining what would now be called a university education than they had in any other country of Western Europe. End quote. Also, the relationship between a tutor and a pupil was more intimate and long-lasting, and it came with reciprocal duties under the law. These were the same as those attached to the widely practiced custom of fosterage of children. In fact, the tutor-pupil relationship could be seen as a form of fosterage, with the tutor as a literary foster father, or a lifelong mentor, and it was treated this way in the laws. Elsewhere in Ireland's Ancient Schools and Scholars, Reverend Healy quotes a translation of a section of the 𝗁𝗵𝗃, perhaps the most important of all the surviving early Irish legal manuscripts. A page of the 𝗁𝗵𝗃 deals with the duties owed between foster pupils and literary foster fathers. It's a long quote, but I'd like to share it all with you because it really paints an idea of the legal relationship between a foster pupil and the literary foster father. Quote, "The tutor was bound to communicate all his knowledge and all his art, both theoretical and practical, to his pupils without reserve, and thus prepare them for their professional degree or formal admission to take the ranks of the bards, Brehons, chroniclers, or readers, as the case might happen to be. The social connection that is considered between the foster pupil and the literary foster father is that the latter is to instruct him without reserve, and to prepare him for his degree, and to chastise him without severity, to feed and to clothe him whilst he is learning his lawful profession. On the other hand, the foster pupil is to assist his tutor in poverty, and to support him in his old age, and to give him the honour price of the degree for which he is being prepared, and all the gains of his art whilst he is learning it, and the first earning of his art after leaving the house of his tutor. And, moreover, the literary foster father has power of judgment and proof and witness upon his foster pupil, as the father has upon his son, and the church upon the tenant of the church lands. The teacher or professor was amply provided for. That provision of the law which compelled the foster pupils to assist their tutors in poverty and maintain them in old age was an admirable institution, calculated to preserve the most kindly feelings between both, all through their lives." End quote. Within the Gaelic schools there were 4 primary divisions of learning: poetry, law, history, and ecclesiastics. But the academic curricula on offer was much broader than just these 4. There were also schools for the study of music, science, languages, and classical studies. Even when we turn to Ireland's legends, we hear about the 3rd century king 𝗁𝗵𝗶𝘀, who was described in the annals of 𝗺𝗵𝗶𝘀 as absolutely the best king that ever reigned in Ireland, wise and learned, valiant and mild, not given causelessly to be bloody as many of his ancestors were. He reigned majestically and magnificently. And during his reign he is said to have founded 3 schools at Tara, one for the study of military science, one for history and literature, and one for law. There was once a time when Ireland was the most highly educated of all the European countries. It was during this epoch that it was known in Latin as Insula Sanctorum Doctorum, the island of saints and scholars, the wise isle in the west. And although there is evidence from Roman documents that Rome really wanted to invade Ireland, seeing it as the final cork in the bottle of their mission on the Western Front, they opted for a relationship of commerce over conquest. This fact, along with its already ancient and advanced civilization, its isolated location sparing Ireland from the dramatic regime reforms that had affected the rest of Europe through the rise and catastrophic crash of the Roman Empire, meant that the arts, education, and the sciences could continue to flourish in Ireland unabated, and it became a sanctuary for monks and scholars alike. How the Irish Saved Civilization is a book by Thomas Cahill, considering the contributions of Irish missionaries, merchants, and educators who travelled across Europe before, during, and after the fall of Rome, and who returned civility and advanced thinking back to the continent that had regressed over several chaotic generations. We also hear how the elite of Europe came to Ireland to be educated. Quote, "Both clerics and laymen from the continent came to the schools of Erin in large numbers to acquire the culture of our Celtic schools. On the other hand, when our Irish scholars went abroad during the 9th and 10th centuries, they were at once entrusted with the highest offices in the continental schools, and proved themselves to be not only amongst the ablest theologians of the time, but also the first men of that age in Greek and Latin literature. It was around this time that, if there was a man found who could speak and write Greek in Western Europe, he was automatically presumed to be Irish, or at least to have been educated in the Irish schools, as these were the only ones that were advanced enough to include these subjects.